Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neo-Fusionism. Neo-Fusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we will be looking at Encountering Naturalism, A Worldview and Its Uses, written by Thomas W. Clark. Thomas Clark is the founder and director of the Center for Naturalism and the creator of Naturalism.org. Very involved in the premise and implications of naturalism. And in this book, he covers two main points. The first is the refutation of free will, as he describes it, contra-causal free will. In other words, the notion that we have the capacity to act of our own volition without any cause and direction. His premise is that reality is entirely deterministic and causal, and therefore everything that we do, every action, every decision, is built upon, 100% built upon and determined by other factors such as our genetic predisposition, the brain makeup that we are born with, in combination with our experiences of our environment, and such that there's no self that is undriven by something else. There's no free will, essentially. And that's probably the first third of the book, maybe the first half of the book, and then the rest of the book is a description of what he proposes to be the progressive implications of naturalism and the progressive policy implications. And that is the part that I really intend to focus on and to dispute. I think that the concept of determinism is something that is accurate. Science has led me to believe that that is exactly the nature of reality. And so I support that, but I don't think that it has necessarily progressive implications. I think that maybe if you are already a progressive, you might find that in naturalism, but I don't think that it's endemic to naturalism. And in fact, I believe that naturalism actually promotes a number of policies that are not progressive at all. And I want to talk about that a little bit today. It's not a very long book. It's less than 100 pages long, and I've selected a few portions of it that I want to read out loud to you, and then refute those, or respond to those, I should say. I wish that I could read more of the book to you, but I don't want to just read from the book. So I'm just going to pick a few key portions, read them to you, and respond. On the whole, it's a pretty good book. It's not profound. I'm not going to call it like a great masterpiece. There's very little new ground covered. He really just kind of describes the premise, applies it to politics, and leaves it at that. So, without any further ado, let me get in here and read a little bit of this book and begin responding to it. All right, he says, quote, "To count yourself a thoroughgoing naturalist is to go beyond what many atheists, humanists, and skeptics are currently willing to accept. Denying God is fine, but denying contra-causal free will, that's a real problem for many. Nor will the progressive implications of a thoroughgoing naturalism be particularly palatable to secular conservatives. If they consider themselves true blue naturalists, they must either deny there are progressive implications of accepting that we're fully caused beings, or formulate a naturalized notion of contra-causal freedom. Very difficult. Such critiques are welcome, since naturalism is by definition based on open inquiry." End quote. So I'm not going to talk about that in great detail. I just wanted to introduce with that quote because exactly what I intend to do with this podcast is to deny that there are progressive implications of accepting that we're fully caused beings. I don't believe that's the case, and so I wanted to kind of start off with that in direct opposition to that statement. So let's move on to another quote. We get into the actual meat of the book. I want to start with actually two different quotes from two different sections. He talks about crime and punishment and criminality and the criminal justice system in two different sections. So I'm going to read the first, and then I'm going to just immediately go in and read the second so that you can get a real good idea of where he's coming from with regard to the law and how naturalism relates to it. So the first quote, he says, "The criminal justice system in the U.S. is shaped by beliefs about retributive punishment that motivate extremely punitive sanctions, among them the death penalty and harsh, non-rehabilitative prison conditions. Support for retribution stems at least partially from a supernaturalist conception of the criminal, who, it is commonly thought, could have chosen not to commit the crime, whatever his internal and external circumstances might have been. Thus, offenders deeply deserve punishment, because they could have overcome these circumstances and acted otherwise, but simply and willfully refused to do so. This sense of strong ultimate responsibility is used to justify inflicting suffering on offenders far beyond what's necessary for deterrence or public safety. Such retribution simply models and perpetuates retaliatory behavior, leaving in its wake vast, unnecessary trauma and degradation. To the extent that criminality is thought to arrive from individuals' self-caused, freely willed choices, its actual biological, social, and economic causes will necessarily go unexplored and unaddressed. The myth of contra-causal free will essentially lets us off the hook. It releases us from our responsibility to thoroughly investigate and remedy the origins of antisocial behavior, which lie in mental illness, poverty, child abuse, and lack of education and economic opportunity. Free will is the bottom line excuse and justification for laissez-faire social policies which, by denying causation, guarantee continuing high levels of dysfunction and alienation, and which therefore perpetuate the cycle of crime and punishment. The emphasis on retribution, often based in the myth of the supernatural soul, is thus ineffective as well as unethically punitive. It's sometimes argued that although many are brought up in deprived, dysfunctional families and neighborhoods, relatively few become criminals. Therefore, it's the individual's free choice that explains criminality. But of course, the reasons why some become offenders and most do not lie in the unique set of circumstances, environmental and genetic, that holds for each person. The details, whether in differing personality traits or the exact influences and events they underwent, make the critical difference. Those ending up on the wrong side of the law had, unfortunately, just the wrong combination of, for instance, abusive parents, troubled peers, and inherited disposition to impulsiveness. To imagine that there's some self-constructing factor which really explains criminality contradicts everything science tells us about ourselves. When we come to appreciate the causal story behind crime, we won't any longer suppose that offenders create themselves and thus deserve to be punished, whether or not it brings about any good consequences. Moreover, we'll pay far more attention to criminogenic factors. We'll seek to prevent crime instead of merely punishing it after the fact. True, it is individuals who commit offenses. They must be dealt with compassionately and effectively. But the reasons they become offenders in the first place lie in the conditions that created them, so we must hold society responsible, ourselves, our families, schools, and communities, as well as offenders, in our quest for a safe, flourishing culture. A major contribution of applied naturalism will be enlightened reform of our criminal justice system to make its main mission crime prevention, not the infliction of punishment for punishment's sake. All right, so that's the first quote about it. It's kind of a long one. I'm going to go right into the second quote here. It's not quite as long, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about that. He says in the second one, quote, "Speaking to an audience of police officers, New York Governor George Pataki, a staunch conservative, once opined that the root cause of crime is criminals. Criminals create themselves, essentially, so the idea that external circumstances play a role in crime is simply to excuse bad behavior. Liberals, on the other hand, are notoriously more likely to focus on the determinants of the criminal, unhealthy family and community environments that sometimes interact with inherited susceptibilities to conduct disorders. Attitudes about criminal justice reflect these opposite assumptions about human nature. Conservatives are more likely to emphasize that punishment is deserved for willful misbehavior, so don't coddle the criminal. Liberals advocate understanding him the better to rehabilitate him and prevent others from following in his footsteps. The more punitive conservative approach, based partially in the free will assumption, has largely carried the day. But with the rise of neuroscience, the idea of contra-causal free will is under considerable pressure. If, as science tends to show, criminals don't create themselves, this undercuts the conservative laissez-faire approach to criminality. Instead, perhaps we should get smart on crime and take into account the causal story behind the offender. Our heavy reliance on punishment might give way to a social behavioral systems approach that emphasizes effective prevention and rehabilitation. In the war of ideas about crime, naturalism suggests that we should be intentional in addressing what causes criminals and stop being merely punitive. This isn't to say that when it comes to crime or any other aspect of human behavior, conservatives always ignore causes, or that liberals don't have significant blind spots about causality. They tend to downplay genetic factors, for instance. Indeed, one argument in the culture wars is about exactly this: which side best grasps the realities of human nature and social dynamics. This is a healthy debate since it keeps both sides honest and establishes common ground, namely that we should be responsive to the empirical facts. Naturalists are committed to respecting the evidence wherever it leads, so as naturalism makes headway, we can hope for more reality-based discourse in the culture wars. End quote. All right, so that was a lot to read. To go over both of those sections, I want to respond by saying that he's right in the sense that we should be approaching crime from two fronts. One would be punishments, jail time, fines, and things like that. And the other, we should be looking at factors that cause and create crime and criminals and the circumstances surrounding them that lead them into criminal behaviors. I think that's accurate. I think that poverty and crime go hand in hand, and so part of addressing crime is also addressing poverty. I think that's completely accurate, but I think that he really makes a presumption about the motivation behind punishment as a antidote to crime. We act based on incentives and disincentives, and regardless of whether or not you find a person to have some sort of free will to be culpable and responsible for what they've done or not, the disincentives and the incentives still work. You can go right to behavioral studies with animals to find that rewards and punishment can be used to modify behavior, and I don't think that we generally look at animals as having some sort of free will that determines whether an animal is going to behave well or poorly. We look at an animal and we say, well, they have some sort of genetic predisposition toward this or that temperament, and or they've been raised to be this way or that way. And so I think that we understand that works for animals. It also works for humans. And so, part of the reason that we have punishment and that the death penalty and prison sentences and generally just punishment is because we want it to serve as a disincentive to other people to not do that thing, which we're trying to discourage. I mean, if you get right down to it, if you had a death penalty for speeding, then I can assure you very few people would speed because nobody would want to risk death in order to go above the speed limit. Now that obviously would be extreme, and I wouldn't think that we would ever do something like that, but the point is that it's very clear and obvious that a harsh enough penalty discourages behavior. If there was no penalty whatsoever for speeding, nobody would follow the speed limit. Nobody would care. Why would they? There's no penalty. That has nothing to do with whether or not people have free will, and it doesn't change when you eliminate free will from the equation. So penalties serve as a disincentive. And the other thing that I think that, this leads into, and this is, I'm sure I'm going to discuss this a little bit in some of the other sections I want to talk about, is that if you follow his logic, he kind of lays it out that a person is not actually responsible for what they do. Then why would we, if punishment is based on the notion that we have that a person is guilty, that they've got some soul that has sinned, that is guilty and deserving of punishment, and that's why we punish, is that it's rooted in this notion of a choice and a guilt and a deserving of punishment sort of mentality. If you're going to eliminate that notion, and with it eliminate the concept of punishment, why wouldn't you just go all the way and say there would be no punishment at all? I mean, it's like you're going to lay out a reduction in punishment because you don't want to lay blame on people. Then, go all the way, because you don't believe that people are actually responsible. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to argue for free will, obviously, but if you're going to make that case, you can't just make it halfway, I guess is what I'm saying. So anyway, I think that his argument there is a little bit weak. We have punishments for a reason. That we can have debates about what the appropriate level of punishment is, but ultimately the purpose of punishment is, I think the purpose of punishment is entirely as a disincentive. I don't, even the notion of justice falls apart if you take away the concept that anyone has any sort of responsibility for what they've done, that nobody should be guilty of anything. Then also nobody can be proud of anything, and it just opens up such a can of worms to take away the self from and the self's ability to make decisions. We make decisions from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed. We make decisions, whether those decisions are deterministic or not, whether there are invisible factors guiding those decisions. We still make decisions, and we still have to be accountable for those decisions, and we still have to be able to be proud of good things we've done and ashamed of bad things we've done. And that doesn't require free will. That's just how we need to operate to have a society. So anyway, I'm going to move on to the next quote, where I can probably find more opportunity to go into that in more detail. So the next section I want to talk about is when he discusses social justice. And this one is also fairly long, and I'm sorry to be reading these long portions, but I just think that this, in order to be able to adequately respond to what he's saying, I need you to really understand his perspective. So let me get right into the section on social justice. He says, quote, "Rooted in Western culture is the widespread assumption of radical individualism, the supposition that persons are at bottom self-made. This works to justify and excuse the increasing disparities in material well-being and social advantages that have followed the dismantling of the 1960s Great Society. On the supernaturalist, soul-based understanding of ourselves, those that fail economically fail partially because of a freely willed refusal to apply themselves or follow the rules. Since it was their self-caused choice not to get ahead, some think they deserve their impoverishment. Likewise, those that succeed deserve their riches, however excessive or disproportionate, since they made themselves who they are. The huge and growing inequalities between rich and poor, exacerbated by conservative policies such as tax cuts for the wealthy and disinvestments in public infrastructure and education, are tolerated partially because they are thought by many to reflect differences in merit derived from the exercise of free will. Inequality, at bottom, is simply the reflection of what people deserve. To the extent that economic and social inequalities are believed to result from human choices unaffected by surrounding conditions, the definition of contracausal free will, such inequalities will be perceived as the natural outcome of self-originated individual differences, not anything that could or should be remedied by social policy. Interventions to reduce inequality will only be thought capable of operating around the margins of what is essentially up to self-caused human choices. The free will assumption thus disempowers and defeats policies to reduce inequality in advance by implying they cannot be effective, or that they somehow infringe our right to ultimate self-determination. Of course, if we really had contracausal free will, our self-determination couldn't be infringed upon. In challenging the myth of radical individualism, science-based naturalism shows that a person's economic and social success is entirely a function of family status at birth, innate talents, access to education and other social resources, and numerous other environmental and biological factors. We can't take credit for what's ultimately a matter of lucky genes and lucky social status at birth. There are no literally self-made men or women that deeply deserve their fortunes. Even the disposition to work hard, compete, and get ahead is entirely a matter of causal factors, good parental role models, a teacher's high expectations for achievement, perhaps even a genetically influenced capacity for industriousness. All this is the luck of the draw. Accepting a naturalist view of ourselves will therefore weaken justifications for inequality based on the notion of deserved success or failure. Those of us living comfortable lives will see that, but for circumstances, we, just like the homeless camped out under the highway, would have been denied our comforts. This insight might increase our empathetic identification with the plight of the less fortunate. It will also help undercut support for social policies, such as tax breaks for the rich, that have generated huge discrepancies in wealth and opportunity, while increasing support for interventions that improve both opportunities and outcomes for the disadvantaged. Although incentives must still exist to encourage hard work, initiative, and risk-taking, they need not and should not result in a grossly skewed distribution of resources. A naturalism that accepts causality will help shift the justification for having a reasonable standard of living from getting what you deserve on the basis of self-caused merit to getting what you need to live a fulfilled, satisfying life. End quote. Now, there's a lot to deal with in this section, especially that last little line there when it proposes that we're going to shift away from getting what you deserve on the basis of self-caused merit to getting what you need to live a fulfilled, satisfying life. If that doesn't sound like a communist approach, from each person according to his ability and to each person according to his need, as is the communist motto, that sounds really familiar. And again, I think that in this scenario here, he basically lays out a premise and doesn't follow it to its conclusion. He adds a little footnote in there where he says incentives must still exist to encourage hard work, initiative, and risk-taking. I think that little throwaway line that he drops in there at the end is an attempt to repel the inevitable criticism that if you take his belief to its conclusion that nobody is responsible for their own condition, even in scenarios where one person makes all the right choices and works hard and gets ahead financially and is able to apply themselves or has some sort of maybe they're highly intelligent and that intelligence pays, it enables them to get a good job and with good pay, that they don't deserve that because they didn't create their own intelligence, that their intelligence was just something that they were born with, or their industriousness is something that they were born with. Their good decision-making ability, their ability to not get drawn into distractions that would prevent them from living prosperous lives. None of that is really their fault because it's something that they were born with, or it's something that they got from their parents, or it's something that they got from society or their experiences. And so that they don't actually deserve to get ahead of someone who makes poor decisions and someone who is not smart, is not industrious, is not capable, is not providing value to someone else who would pay them in accord with the value that they provide. And so, in other words, what he's arguing against is ultimately the concept of meritocracy, the idea that you get what you deserve based on the value that you provide to someone else. And he doesn't just take it all the way. Like, why should anybody really have more than anybody else? And he just, there's that little throwaway line at the end that there has to be incentives to work hard. Well, that's the root of the whole thing. Nobody's saying that rich people, nobody that is taken seriously would say that rich people are like better souls. They have better souls, and like poor people have bad souls or are sinners or something. It's just this kind of a impression that he has of the opposing view. It's all built on incentives. It's the same thing as crime and punishment. It's all built on incentives, and as opposed to like disincentives with crime, it's all built on incentives. So that if you work hard, if you study, if you learn, if you apply yourself, if you maneuver yourself into a position of success, that you deserve that success because of what you have done to get there, and that exists in order to provide an incentive to people to do those things. Has nothing to do with some sort of deserving free will. So I think that it's kind of, yes, okay, we want people to be prosperous and we want people to be successful, and so we should say, all right, if someone comes from really disadvantaged position, maybe society can mitigate that disadvantage in some way. And that's, we have public schools so that, poor people can still get a basic education, and we have scholarships, and we have systems for people we have avenues and opportunities for people to be able to climb out of poverty. And we should have those sorts of opportunities for people. But I think he just takes it a little too far here to kind of argue against the very concept of individualism, to argue against the very concept of meritocracy. He just takes it a little too far. So there's that. That's my interpretation of that. The very existence of inequality is a necessary structure to promote work, success, striving, effort, excellence. Excellence is rewarded. That it has to be rewarded, whether it's based on deterministic causes or not. It has to be rewarded. Now, do I think there's components of inequality that are excessive? Like, is there a degree of inequality that's damaging to society? Sure there is. There does reach a degree of inequality that becomes destructive. And there are ways in which wealthy and powerful people manipulate the government, manipulate the laws, manipulate society in order to keep themselves at an advantage. But people want to not just have every person start from the starting line. People want to be able to provide an advantage to their children. They work hard to be able to provide adequate resources, whether it's tutoring or whether it's being able to go to a good college or what have you. People want to provide resources to their children, and I think that creates a system where people start out with an advantage because their parents worked hard to provide them with that advantage. I don't think that we should take that away in an effort to eliminate all causal factors for success and failure. I think that kind of eliminates our ability to build as families, to build strength as families, and to build strength as societies. Intergenerational wealth is power, and we should be able to strive for power. That's how we succeed. So anyway, that's my take on that section, and then let me move right on to the next portion that I want to share with you: self-control and the role of government. He says, quote, Attitudes about behavioral health, such as mental illness, addiction, and obesity, are often shaped by underlying beliefs about the self and its freedom. One side, usually more conservative, says that persons have free will and should be able to snap out of their depression. They should just choose to stop overeating, drinking, smoking, and gambling. The emphasis is on personal responsibility for achieving self-control and making healthy choices, not treatment and social policy. The other side, usually more liberal, believes people often need help with these problems, so why not prevent and treat behavioral disorders the way we do other diseases? Why shouldn't the state play a role in fostering healthy behavior and encouraging wise choices? Self-control and mental health are achieved not through the miracle of free will, but through education, environments, and policies that permit optimal development and that provide help when things go wrong. These two very different ideas about willpower and self-control underlie arguments about the role of government. If people are capable of simply choosing to exert self-control, then they don't need help, and if they fail to control themselves, it's basically their fault. This view puts all responsibility on the individual, letting the state and the rest of us off the hook. This is, of course, the perfect rationale for small government libertarian conservatism, hence the right's affection for the idea of personal responsibility. On the other hand, if one's capacity for self-control isn't a matter of contra-causal free will, but is instead caused by various factors, for example, parental modeling of responsible behavior and consistent rules in schools and communities, then responsibility for self-control is distributed outside the individual. Recognizing this, we might be more proactive in creating home, school, and community environments in which children learn effective self-management techniques. And if we accept that choices about eating, drinking, smoking, and gambling are a function of external temptations as well as individual discipline, that's a good reason to adopt policies of public self-management. For instance, regulations that limit the advertising and availability of junk food, cigarettes, and slot machines. Similarly, seeing that mental illnesses, such as depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, aren't self-chosen character flaws, but syndromes traceable to neurological and environmental conditions, should prompt us to prevent these conditions when possible and offer treatment when prevention fails. This debate about self-control and the role of government, facets of the culture wars, hinges considerably on ideas about the metaphysics of human nature. Naturalism, based on a scientific view of human beings as fully caused creatures, suggests that we have a shared responsibility to create the conditions in which people can learn and exert self-control and make good, productive choices. All right, well, here again he just kind of goes down the rabbit hole a little bit with this argument against personal responsibility. Again, I'm not saying that there are no external factors, and I'm not saying that there's no such thing as mental health issues, but we should put the primary responsibility for people's lives, their self-control, and their conduct within society. We need to put that responsibility primarily on the individual. He seems to argue here that, well, while we should maybe make allowances for personal responsibility, he says, and if we accept the choices about eating, drinking, smoking, and gambling are a function of external temptations as well as individual discipline, and I think in that line is the only spot that he gives any credence to the concept of individual discipline. He basically says, well, that's kind of a footnote, but the real premise here is that people don't have control. They don't have control over their external environments and what brought them to the point they're at. They don't have control over their internal motivations and qualities that would enable them to exert self-control. In other words, we don't have control over our self-control. And so, here's where he just isn't adding up quite correctly, because if you create a society that demands personal responsibility, okay, that is an external influence on every member of that society to develop methods of self-control. And as long as you tell people that they are not responsible for what they do, that is going to erode the drive toward self-control. Who is going to really make the effort to develop a sense of self-control in a society that says there's no such thing as self-control? You don't have any control over your self-control. If you don't have any self-control, it's not your fault. It's the continual degradation of the concept of a self, of an individual, and of one's ability to control oneself and control one's immediate surroundings and control one's life. We need, as a society, to promote self-control, to promote the notion that self-control exists and that we can develop self-control, that we can be the masters of our own selves, that if we are depressed, that we can work through our depression, that we can talk to people around us and that care about us, and maybe talk to a therapist if it's bad enough, or if it's debilitating, take some medication for it. But we should not go straight to the medicine if somebody is feeling down about something, if they're sad, if they're upset, if they're depressed, if they're clinically depressed, if they're depressed all the time. And I don't want to sound cold-hearted and say that every single person has control over their depression. I've been through bouts of depression. I've been through my own challenges that I'm not going to go into in detail, but I work through it because I believe that I can. And that's half the battle right there, believing that you can work through it, because people have had the same mental makeup, the same tendencies and neurological tendencies and genetic makeup for a very long time. I mean, evolution moves slowly. So long before we had medicine, we had people who had psychological dysfunctions of different sorts. But we built societies to the best of our ability in order to not have people be debilitated by these things. And so what that meant was that people needed to work through their problems. And in some cases that would have meant going on a vision quest, where someone would be able to interact with their subconscious forces in the form of provoked hallucinatory experiences, where people would be able to really dig into the subconscious forces of their own mind that is at the root of these depressive disorders, and find their way out the other side. I think that is something that, we don't just have this species. We aren't just this species that's plagued by mental dysfunction. People who have these genetic predispositions to debilitating neurological dysfunction, those people wouldn't procreate. They wouldn't survive. They wouldn't be able to defend themselves and defend their families and defend their tribes. They wouldn't be able to survive to have this constant debilitating mental disorders. We would evolve past that. We don't have these maladaptive traits that run through our society because we're incapable of managing our own minds and our own behavior, and we've got all these addictions and we've got all these problems that we're totally incapable of doing anything about. We can't control our environment, we can't control our own minds, we can't control our genetic disposition. We're total victims of our own selves and everything else. And that's the mentality that this progressivism fosters and uses the scientific premise of causality to underlie this sort of victimhood mentality. It's not healthy. You may be a fully deterministic and caused creature, but one of the things in you that has been built into you genetically, has been given to you by your ancestors, is your adaptability and your capacity to heal yourself, to overcome your own problems, because you have to do it in order to survive. You can't just give up because you will die. So that's like, we have the capacity to the human mind is like very plastic. It's our body. I mean, you break a bone, the bone heals, right? Your brain heals. Your thoughts, they heal themselves. I'm not saying that, there's no place for, psychiatry and prescription psychiatric drugs, like that has no place whatsoever in society. But, I don't want to make that case that there's no, there are people who are fundamentally dysfunctional. It's just like there are people who are born with deformities in their body. You can be born with a deformity in your brain that's basically like a genetic mental dysfunction of some sort. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I am saying that as a society, to embrace the notion that we have no control and that society is responsible for propping us up, for holding our hand, for helping us heal, for helping us become complete human beings, because we cannot do it on our own, because we don't have the capacity for self-control. It's just the proliferation of victimhood and weakness. It's like, you are weak. You are a weak person. You're weak because of everything around you. You're weak because of everything that you've been born with. You're weak because of your parents. You're weak because of this and that and the other thing. And there's just this tiny little footnote in the quote that's, oh yeah, well, individual responsibilities fits in there somewhere. But, that's just the complete wrong approach. And naturalism does not demand that sort of victimhood approach to our own minds. We can control our minds. We should endeavor to control our minds, and we should stop getting our antidepressants and our Zoloft and our whatever medicine we feel like we need to get every time something's wrong, because we don't feel that we have any control, because we've sacrificed all of our notions of self-control. So that's how I feel about that. So let me move on to the next quote here. I'm going to take up all your time, so let's move on. This section is called Naturalism and the Open Society. He says, quote, "As heated as the culture wars may be, they are actually characteristic of a healthy open society in which ideas are debated, not literally fought over. Keeping society open, as opposed to authoritarian, is a fundamental value, and naturalism is by nature friendly to democracy and free debate. Because it's premised on a commitment to rational empiricism, naturalism keeps our focus on the observable physical and social world here on Earth, not the unobservable, supernatural world to come, should it exist. It therefore isn't ideological and divisive in the way that many non-empirical worldviews are, clinging to a fixed understanding no matter what the contrary evidence. Likewise, naturalists aren't defensive or self-righteous about naturalism, or at least they shouldn't be. They acknowledge our cognitive fallibility, that our view of reality might stand improvement. It is through unfettered debate and gathering evidence, not by imposing an ideology, that our understanding of the world becomes more accurate and thus more effective. A commitment to these cognitive virtues translates directly into support for an open society. In a diverse democratic society where there are conflicting ideas about ultimate reality, it's vital that there be agreement about our shared present reality. We have a cognitive responsibility to one another, an ethical obligation to hold well-justified, reliable beliefs about the world we have in common. For instance, about global warming, avian flu, and the causes of genocide. It's science and evidence-based rationality that allow this. Naturalism, not supernaturalism, is committed to empiricism and thus champions the creation of a cognitive common ground which multicultural societies depend upon to flourish. Since this common ground depends on the free exchange of ideas and information, naturalists are naturally and strongly motivated to keep society open. On the other hand, once authoritarian, non-empirical religions and political ideologies take over, the prospects for an open society diminish rapidly. The quest for ideological conformity, often inspired by absolutist thinking, can involve the violent suppression of opposing views, for example, in the international jihad of some extreme Islamists. Of course, non-religious jihads that champion decidedly unscientific, non-empirical understandings of human nature and history, white supremacy, Nazism, the inevitable triumph of the proletariat, have been mounted as well, with horrific consequences. Hence, the importance of preventing the imposition of a single conception of ultimate reality, not even naturalism, on citizens who should be thinking for themselves. This will help keep the culture wars a non-violent conflict of ideas, not arms. Now, in this section, I wholeheartedly agree. I agree with him about his conception of the free exchange of ideas. And there's a little bit of a contradiction here. In his statement that we need a cognitive common ground in which we share our concept of reality. He says it's vital that there be agreement about our shared present reality. We have a cognitive responsibility to hold well-justified, reliable beliefs. So there's a little conflict here when he says that we need to have a common cognitive common ground. In other words, we share an understanding with each other about the nature of reality in order to have a functional society. But he also says we need to have an open society with the open exchange of ideas. There's a bit of conflict there because, and it's a conflict that I recognize, and I'm not entirely certain how you go about dealing with it. You do need to have an open exchange of ideas and allow people to believe and understand reality the way that they want to, because otherwise you're imposing your vision of reality upon other people, and that's when you enter into this part he talks about in the later quote about authoritarian suppression of opposing views. So yeah, ideally the open dialogue and the open exchange of ideas has as its goal the creation of a cognitive common ground, where we want to exchange ideas with one another with the hope that we will ultimately arrive at the truth, right? That we're not going to just isolate ourselves into these different separate groups, and each has their own conception of what reality is, how it works, how society works, how society should work, etc., without having some sort of collective goal, I suppose, of sharing our ideas with one another in order to achieve an understanding of commonality. Because I think that there's a sort of a sense that I have, that although I'm 100% in support of people being able to think freely and be able to make up their own minds and not have it imposed, it's kind of challenging in some regards to have a society, a single society, a single culture, a single nation, a single group of people occupying a unified geographic territory, even a town, that have fundamentally different ideas about the way reality is and the way reality works. But we've had that for a very long time. I mean, it's since the rise of and the spread of Christianity in Europe. I mean, I'm going to take Europe as the example because it's probably, the area that I know the most history of, but there have been competing worldviews, but those competing worldviews led to a lot of bloodshed as Christianity spread and people resisted. Now, that's, from the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism, there was a lot of bloodshed involved in that as well, with people holding different views of reality, but occupying a single contiguous geographic area under a single, ruler, or a single, supposedly within one single society, where people hold fundamentally different views of reality, that can create tension. And so a society and a culture, particularly a culture, if you think about what a culture is, kind of depends on people having a shared concept of reality. If their concept of how reality works is different, if your concept of the nature of reality is fundamentally different from that of your neighbor, there's only a limited degree to which you can say that you and your neighbor are part of the same culture. And if you and your neighbor are part of different cultures, are you really a single society, or are you just completely balkanized and fractured? And I'm certainly not, trying to lead this line of thought toward some sort of homogenous enforcement of ideas of single, like, every person must think this authoritarian sort of mind control. Like, that's not what I'm arguing, but there's a tension there. I hope you understand what I'm driving at here. There's a tension between allowing everybody to think differently and the end result of having everybody think differently, and losing our cohesiveness and losing that cognitive common ground that he talks about. So that's all I'm going to say on that section. On the whole, I probably agree with more that he says in that section than in any other. On the whole, I think that I just want to add a few closing thoughts. And that is about a conception that is common among naturalists, and I also think that the perspectives of pantheism kind of go hand in hand with naturalism in a lot of ways, and so you'll find the same perception among pantheists, but also among scientific naturalists that everything is connected, right? Everything is caused by something else. Everything results in effects of the future of everything, and everything is just this big network of connection, right? And that's the principle of logos that I talked about in the first episode. And that the concept is that connection of everything to everything else should foster an awareness of our existence as a component in a greater whole, and that therefore this network of factors, this network of things that all work together in a system, should cause us to view society as a collective unit, and that we're all should be cooperating and working together to achieve these goals, and that's somehow contrary to like a rugged individualism, a competitive approach, that like the idea of the individual acting autonomously is a myth, and conservatism and republicanism are rooted in the individual, and therefore those are rooted on misunderstanding of reality, but that the collectivism, the cooperative nature of the big village, the human family, as all being part of one collective unit is the right way to go, which is the progressive way to go. I think that completely misses the point of how this all works. Things in reality, people, animals, life forms of every sort, and every other thing really acts in a sort of competitive manner. The system can't be escaped, right? The system of interrelation of one thing to the next isn't something that we can just break out of, right? So I like to look at the idea of a lion chasing a gazelle in the jungle or in the savannah or what have you, right? That's a system. That's part of the system of life, the circle of life, right? They're both components of a single ecosystem. They're both integral parts of this ecosystem that all works in conjunction with everything else, but not deliberately. You have to understand, it's not deliberate. The lion and the gazelle are not cooperating. There is no cooperation there. They have different goals. The lion wants to catch the gazelle, and the gazelle does not want that to happen. They're in competition with each other. They can't escape the system of interrelation. It's universal. But within that system, all of the factors, particularly when, it's most obvious to us when we look at life, that even plants are competing with each other for sunlight, for resources in the soil, right? There's an endless competition within life. That's the nature of reality, is that we are all competing, and that is how evolution happens. Everything is competing for resources and for survival and for access to mates. Procreative access it's an endless, thoroughgoing competition. And the only time and manner in which living things cooperate with each other is in order to create a smaller system that exists to compete with other systems, like a colony of ants only cooperate with each other in order to enable the colony itself to survive better in competition with other ant colonies and with other creatures, in order to gain access to resources and gain access to reproductive capacity, right? It's even the cooperation itself only exists in order to enhance competitive capacity. And so to look at competition as some sort of deviation from the naturalistic principles that guide reality is a flawed view. And so naturalism is fundamentally individualistic, particularly for humans. We are a social species, but we're not ants. We're not devoid of individuality. We're not devoid of our own particular drives to survive. We're a combination of the two, and we'll get into that more in some of the other books that we're going to look at, because we're going to be exploring this topic in great detail as this series continues. So that was the point that I wanted to make in regards to that. I think naturalism, when viewed honestly, naturalism is perfectly compatible with a more competitive approach to reality, because evolution is competitive, and right-wing ideas and conservative ideas tend to embrace competition and also to embrace tradition. I think that naturalism should embrace the concept and the value of tradition, and I'll get into that also in some future episodes when we look at books that address those topics specifically. So there's my response to that. I want to say now, before I go, that I do have my Patreon page up and running. So if you're liking the book reviews, if you're liking the concept of neo-fusionism, that we can take principles of paleoconservatism and principles of naturalism, and we can kind of combine them, and that they are fundamentally compatible. Naturally compatible. If you think that's a good idea, and you think that this is something that is going to benefit the Republican Party to have this sort of neo-fusionist faction within it, then I would encourage you to search for my Patreon page. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, or you can just Google neo-fusionist Patreon, and I'm sure it'll bring you to where you want to go. That will help me advertise the podcast. It will help me acquire new books. I mean, I have a stack of books on my bookshelf that I'm going to be working my way through, but I also need to stay on top of some of the books that are coming out now, and so you can help me do that by being a patron. And it's the podcast right now. I don't know where this can go. I want to take it as far as I can. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a necessary idea. I think that under the threat of cultural Marxism, we're finding that ideas that the progressives don't support actual science the way they claim to. When you look at things like gender, when you look at things like evolution, when you look at things like human nature, that their conception of who we are and how we work and what we are, they might claim to support evolution, but it's only in the sense that it provides them with a weapon to use against tradition. Because if you look at what evolutionary theory says about who we are and what we are, it does not mesh with progressivism. It just doesn't. Progressivism is based on its own particular ideology and mythology that does not flow with science. So this is an important thing for us to talk about, and I want to at some point move beyond the podcast. I mean, I'm not going to stop doing the podcast, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice to have like a nonprofit organization that could really spread this message and help to build this movement that I'm trying to create. So that's why I'm looking for patrons that can help me get this off the ground. And if that's you, then please check out my Patreon page and consider donating even $1 a month. So now that I've made that pitch, I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. Until next time, bye.